If we don't have any kind of information on why these NGOs are getting so much government money.
And by giving these billions of euros to these organisations, which are not publicly accountable and have no democratic accountability, you can get away with it, and you can obscure where the money goes.
So something that really shocked many people in Brussels was the report from an otherwise obscure organisation known as the Court of Auditors, who are in charge of looking into financial matters across the EU. They released a really blockbuster, by their standards, it's obviously still kind of couched in the language of EU technocrats, but by their standards, blockbuster report about the degree of the lack of transparency in NGO funding. Richard, this has obviously been a very big theme for us at MCC Brussels. We're publishing reports as fast as we can, trying to get to the bottom of it. But what did you kind of take from this report about the scale? And this was by an EU institution admitting how little information there is about the funding of NGOs.
I think the very underlying question in this case is that this report by the Court of Auditors actually points out very well. Why do we need NGOs in this scale? Like, why do we need NGOs to implement EU policies? We have thousands of civil servants in the EU Commission, and not to speak about all the national and local governments who should also implement a lot of EU policies. Why do we even need these NGOs? First of all, we don't even know exactly what an NGO is, because every government entity has a different definition of NGOs. Often it's just a self-declaration of NGOs. And the second was that we don't have any kind of information on why these NGOs are getting so much government money. So, I mean, these are non-governmental organizations. At the same time, they are at the very heart of implementation of EU policies. So this actually points out that there's an almost symbiotic relationship between EU policies and NGOs. And we don't know exactly how it works, because the intricacies of these relationships are hidden very well in the public, from the public, because all these databases are not connected, all these definitions are not uniform, all these different budgetary positions are a bit contradictory. So this vagueness was created on purpose, and there is no political intention to create real transparency.
Yeah, and this is part and parcel of how they kind of have to operate, isn't it, Mick?
Yes. I mean, first of all, let's say chapeau, hats off to MCC Brussels, because they're well ahead of the curve on this subject with the fantastic reports that you published over the last month or so, before the auditors came out with this story. So I think that's real kudos. As Richard says, there's a deliberate policy here of you have these NGOs, you give them money. The EU knows what these NGOs are going to come back and say that they campaign for or support, or they've done a report which supports existing EU policies on migration or the Green Deal or whatever it is that Brussels wants to push. And then the EU is able to say, Brussels and the European Commission is able to say, well, we are following the advice of these independent campaigners who have raised these important issues. And it's all a self-perpetuating circle. And by giving these billions of euros to these organisations, which are not publicly accountable and have no democratic accountability, you can get away with it, and you can obscure where the money goes and all the rest of it. So that the fact that even the EU's own body now has to say this is a bit of a problem, the lack of transparency, that tells you that the actual problem is many times worse than that. Because for them to even go that far demonstrates the depth of the problem. And I think what we have to really come back to, which I think the point that the MCC made very well in the first place, is this is not simply a question of financial mismanagement or corruption. This is political corruption. This is a corruption of democracy. That's what these NGOs exist for, to get around the EU's lack of democratic authority and democratic support by doling out power and money to these NGOs and saying this shows that we have the support of civic society for what we're doing in Brussels. And there's no democratic accountability involved in it. No voter ever voted for €1 to go to any of these organisations. So, and that's the real political nub of the problem, not simply financial mismanagement, but the corruption of democracy.
Yeah, completely. And Richard, I mean, give us. I know you spent a long time with some of these databases and trying to get to the bottom of it. Give us and our viewers a sense of what it really is like to try and navigate this maze. I mean, the report from the Court of Auditors talks about the fact that NGOs would be listed an NGO in one database, but listed not as an NGO in another, that there's non-information on how much money some of them received, even though you can tell they've received money. Give us a sense of what it's like trying to navigate these databases.
Well, how to begin with? So there are, for example, the EU has different kinds of management implementation. Some EU policies are directly managed by the EU only, but this is only a fraction. But most of the EU policies are actually in so-called shared management with the member states and local governments together. And in both types of management, the NGOs play a key role. But because these are, from a bureaucratic point of perspective, different types of management, we have different databases for them. And the same NGO might participate actually in both, but they will receive different metadata for one participating in one and different metadata for participating in the other column. So it's very, very hard to actually see how much overall EU money an NGO gets, even though we know that, under shared management in this, and then it's further distributed across programs. So, for example, the LIFE program has a different database than the Horizon program, and then other. So it's even worse than that. There are also completely independent databases from this, like the funding and tenders portal. Somehow they are all connected. So often enough, you go in the very back. So you go in this section of the website, and you can find the raw data. And then according to, if you use one part of the raw data and combine it from other database with the raw data from other, then you can make some connections. But it is very, very, very hard to find, and it's not. And often these raw data are not very well, not machine readable in a fashion that you can automatize this process, which is necessary with tens of thousands of entries, because you cannot do this by hand. So this is what I meant by hiding stuff in public from the public. Actually, on paper, you can access this data, but you cannot process this data in any reasonable fashion.
Yeah, and Mick, I mean, just before the Court of Auditors published its report, there was a kind of signed letter by hundreds of NGOs who were complaining about the extra scrutiny that they were receiving. One of my favorite lines from the letter they all signed was that actions of right-wing groups were undermining civil society, whereas actually it's these groups have really undermined the very concept of civil society.
Absolutely, yeah. And they have made a mockery of it, the very idea of civil society, that they are simply the kind of provisional militant wing of the political elites in Brussels. That's what they exist to be, the kind of radical voice of the Brussels bureaucracy. And they've completely destroyed any idea of civil society being anything more than that. It's just state-funded, EU-funded, glove puppet organisations who are acting on behalf of the EU elite. So the idea that they should protest about this being a right-wing attack on democracy in Europe is an outrageous inversion of the truth.
And in typical EU fashion, Richard, I mean, the Court of Auditors proposed some remedies, but that basically amounted to saying, we should probably get around to looking at some of these databases properly by 2029 or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the Court of Auditors can only make recommendations, and they point very much at current EU legislation that is already in force, that is reads like this, that, we should create transparency. And then the second section of the article is like, we should create transparency by issuing an assessment with other recommendations until 2029. That is so it's basically pushing. There are no really firm policies in place that are aimed to create transparency. Only commitments on paper, and I mean, this is done on purpose. It's quite clearly done on purpose.